Hello again there, everybody, and welcome to the next of our recorded sessions. This time we're going to be getting into the 1980s and 1990s. And so, as I said with the last section, with the 50s, 60s, and 70s, odds are we've gotten into some of the time periods that some of your family members probably have personal experience with. And in some respects, it's possible that we've gotten now into a section that will be addressing things that you might have personal experience with, right? This is a period that is 30, 40 years in the past now. So things maybe you have some kind of memory of, or in some cases, maybe have heard references to it more often in your daily lives, and so some of these things might be a little bit more familiar than some of the things that we've talked about in the past. These are decades that are a little bit more difficult to really kind of deal with from a historical standpoint, because the closer we get to the present, the harder it is for us to make really clear and sort of conclusive determinations and analyses of the long-term consequences of some of the events that we talk about, right? And so since that's really the main goal of history, is being able to understand what was happening in the past and then use that knowledge as a way to understand the present, the closer we get to the present, the less of that kind of sort of broad view we're really able to develop. And so there's aspects of the 1980s and 1990s that we can certainly see sort of having ripple effects down to the present, but in some respects, it's still going to take a few decades before we can really look at those particular years and say, these are the clear causes and effects that, that come about from that. And so what we're going to do here is talk more about some of the broad trends that are going on, some of the specific developments that take place as well, but it's going to be a little bit different from the way that we've dealt with previous topics and previous time periods, just partially because we're still close enough to this that it's a little bit tricky to really make some of those connections as far as what's historically significant and what's not, because we still have to actually see that for ourselves in some respects. We talked about the 1970s and the emergence of a very sort of divided nation in a lot of respects. The presidency after Nixon's resignation is really struggling, and you have Presidents Ford and Carter that finish out the 1970s, neither one of which is really terribly successful, neither one of which is really terribly effective. And so it becomes a matter of what candidate is going to emerge in the 1980 election that's really going to be effective in sort of presenting the American voter with a sort of popular alternative. And the person that steps into that role is Ronald Reagan. Reagan is still one of the more kind of polarizing presidents in American history. He is beloved by big chunks of the population, where other chunks of the population see him as sort of taking the country towards a sort of a long-term destination that they don't really care for. He wins two massive landslides. The 1984 victory for Reagan is probably about the biggest electoral victory of any president in American history. And he is, in some ways, able to really kind of pick up the torch of the Nixon campaign in 1968 and 1972 by appealing to a wide variety of Americans, whether it's the working class, whether it is the wealthy, sort of traditionally lately traditionally support the Republican Party. There is still an aspect of anti-communism that is part of the Republican campaign and Reagan's appeal. He also has a very, very good sort of oratorical and rhetorical talent, right? So he's able to make a seemingly personal connection with lots and lots of American voters. There are people who are opponents of big government, right? This is still a voting generation that remembers, in some cases, the New Deal, that remembers Johnson's Great Society, and want to sort of resist those kinds of tendencies. There are a lot of different groups that Reagan is able to sort of connect with that will help power his elections in 1980 and in 1984. In some cases, these are sort of voting blocks and voting tendencies that will continue to appear over and over again, voting for the Republican Party all the way down to the present. So whether you're looking at the victories of George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004, or if you look at the victory of Donald Trump in 2016, similar kinds of voting constituencies are supporting the Republican candidate in each of those elections. So what kinds of things is Reagan doing then while he's president, and what kinds of sort of countercultures are there? Well, Reagan is really focused on deregulating the American economy. So he tries very hard to remove a lot of government oversight, government regulations, in the theory that this is going to free up a sort of a free market, laissez-faire capitalism that's going to supposedly help all parties and all parts of the economy and all parts of society gain some kind of improvement in the long run. So this certainly does result in the expansion of a sort of a young, maybe into middle-aged generation that really emphasizes acquisition, right? They emphasize consumerism, not just regular consumerism, but conspicuous consumption, right? You want to buy the most obviously expensive thing that you can. You want to present yourself as being part of the nouveau riche, right? Somebody who is extremely wealthy and has personal and business connections that are impressive and define you as an upwardly mobile kind of individual, right? These people are known as yuppies. It is a cultural sort of acronym for young, upwardly mobile professional. So that is known during the 1980s as a yuppie. Around the same time, business people start to become celebrities of their own right. And this is really where the Donald Trump sort of mystique starts to emerge. He's certainly not the only one of these people, but this is when his sort of persona or mythology begins to develop. But there is certainly a flip side to all of this, right? Because even though there are sort of pop culture and broader cultural references to these kinds of developments, there is still certainly a large section of the American population that is not benefiting. The American economy is struggling. There is a lot of, shall we say, foreign investment. A lot of American businesses begin to be bought up by Asian or Middle Eastern kinds of interests. And culturally speaking, you see then the growth of punk and rap as being very much a reaction to these kinds of inequalities, right? So you have this sense of alienation that many young people have with an economy that doesn't seem to provide them with any opportunities or any options. You have a political system that seems geared almost exclusively for white, middle, or upper class Americans. And so there is this cultural kind of reaction that says there needs to be some sort of outlet by which young people can express the fact that they feel sort of marginalized or disenfranchised during this time period. There is also a significant kind of change in economic and sort of population settlement patterns at the time. So from the 1970s through the 1990s, there is a lot of government defense spending that ends up being directed towards southern states and western states. This comes to be known as the Sunbelt. And so lots of money gets poured into places like Florida or Georgia or Tennessee or places like California, where a lot of American science and technology during that time period is really either a direct or indirect growth of this kind of widespread and massive government spending. And it's generally geared towards defense spending. So technological innovations that will sometimes find their way into average everyday households oftentimes are spurred by, in this case, spurred by defense spending and defense technologies. A good example of that is what happens in Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley is now the sort of, I don't want to say undisputed tech center of the world, but certainly right up there. But it actually begins to be a significant force in American science and technology because of widespread defense spending that the government is sort of funneling into companies that end up there or have begun there. And this is, if you're not familiar with it, this is sort of in central California near the San Francisco Bay Area, right? And so you have, on the one hand, a significant kind of economic change and expansion that results from this, but certainly also a significant kind of population change as well, as people are moving into these areas to fill those jobs. These areas then end up having sort of a higher percentage of more highly educated people. Certainly this is going to change then property values. It's going to change the sort of political leanings of some of these regions away from the kind of political issues that had originally dominated them when they might have been more agricultural or more heavy industry or that sort of thing. Into the 1990s, after Reagan loses well, he doesn't lose, he serves his 2 terms, and then that's essentially the last opportunity for Reagan to serve as president. You have into the 1990s a shift in terms of the sort of dominant generational issues that start to be the focus of politics and be the focus of society in many respects. And so this is the emergence onto the scene, really, of Generation X. And Generation X tends to be a generation born in the very mid to late 1970s, that come of age into the 1980s and 1990s, that begin the process of sort of reimagining the idea of a more socially active, a more socially kind of aware generation. But they are also dealing with a country that is still very much traditional in terms of its political and sort of authoritative makeup. So in the 1990s, mid-1990s, there emerges this much more divisive kind of situation between Republicans and Democrats in federal government. Republicans introduced this plan that they call the Contract with America. The Contract with America was the brainchild of the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who basically said the American people want the government to drastically reduce sort of federal operations, whether that is social programs, whether that is government regulatory agencies, whether that is foreign affairs, whatever the case may be. The president at the time, Bill Clinton, is a Democrat, and he is certainly not a Democrat in the vein of somebody like Lyndon Johnson, who wants an expanded kind of government presence in these areas. But Clinton wants to, at the very least, sort of maintain the Democratic Party's traditional, certainly sort of mid to late 20th century, traditional stance of being the party of sort of more government involvement in providing support and providing resources for the American people. And so you have this huge budget debate where the two sides dig in their heels. Both sides refuse to back down. Gingrich and the Republicans suggest that their contract with America is the sort of the wishes of the majority of the American people. Clinton and the Democrats say that's not the case. Ultimately, the Democratic Party manages to sort of spin all of this in such a way that they come out looking better. Gingrich and the Republicans end up losing influence in federal politics for a time. But the difficulty that Clinton faces is he is sort of beset by a number of scandals that end up undermining his ability to really advance his agenda. And so by the time he leaves office in the year 2000, it is very much an open race in a lot of respects as far as whether the Democrats or Republicans will be on top in the election of 2000. So even though the Republican Party in the sort of mid to late 1990s is losing a little steam, that certainly doesn't mean that it has been sort of driven to the fringes of American politics. It just means that there's this temporary period when the Democratic Party has sort of a bit of a majority, let's say. Certainly with the election of George W. Bush, that balance, that those scales are going to be tipped once again in the opposite direction. But there is, socially speaking, culturally speaking, a fairly significant kind of a change that happens during the 1990s that seems to reflect a country that is becoming increasingly violent. And this is going to play into longer term aspects of what's come to be known as the culture wars. The kinds of incidents that take place during the 1990s seem to a lot of Americans to represent a country that is sort of going off the rails. So there are all kinds of these different incidents, increasing numbers and increasing publicity of mass shootings, whether they're at schools or at other public kinds of events or public spaces. There are some very significant kinds of, let's say, violent incidents. I don't know how you would categorize them. For one, in the spring of 1993, there is a cult that sort of barricades itself into a compound outside of Waco, Texas. And as the Federal Bureau of Investigation is trying to sort of dislodge this group, one thing leads to another. The compound catches fire, almost certainly because the people inside have lit the fire intentionally themselves. Ultimately, this results in more than 80 people dying. There is a bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City a couple years later that kills nearly 170 people. This is done by a domestic terrorist. Essentially, it is a member of a right-wing militia group. And there's also the initial bombing of the World Trade Center, which is really one of the first times, perhaps the first time, that there is an incident of international terrorism that directly affects the United States on American soil. There are riots in Los Angeles that relate to the acquittal of the police officers who were videotaped beating Rodney King. There are a number of these different kinds of events that happen, every few years, every 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, to make it seem as though the country is going through this period of increased violence. In actuality, criminal statistics, crime statistics show that the crime rate, especially violent crime rate, actually declines pretty steadily after 1991. And generally speaking, it's still either declining or fairly low compared to previous decades in a lot of respects. But that question of criminal behavior, that question of sort of pervasive violent crime, also contributes to increasing conversations and debates over the issue of gun control. And so during the 1990s in particular, this is when gun control as a political issue starts to get more and more and more incendiary, right? It becomes more and more sort of venomous in the way that the two sides begin to talk about that issue, whether it is the side that's in favor of gun control, whether it's the side that is sort of arguing that the Second Amendment should be a kind of an all or nothing proposition. And so you see a lot of these kinds of antecedents, right? These kinds of concerns or conversations or debates or discussions that in many ways will kind of prefigure and point in the direction of kinds of things that are much more common in political debates today. And so it is a couple decades that really do lay a lot of foundations for the kinds of really contentious and really polarized and polemical kinds of politics and society and culture that we experience in the United States today. So that's where we're going to pause here. Our next recording is actually going to deal more with some of the political changes that take place in terms of expanded representation for minorities in American politics during the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s. Some of the consequences that increasing diversity in the United States actually has, some of the sort of white backlash against some of that diversity, and then leading us up to the 2000s and the beginnings of the War on Terror and that kind of thing. So I hope everybody out there is doing really well. Let me know if you've got any questions. Make sure that you're checking out all the recordings. Make sure that you're checking out all of the full PowerPoints so that you get all of that material for quizzes and exams and what have you. And I will see you soon when we talk about the remainder of the 1990s and then into the early 2000s.